Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. So, this week I'm going to be taking a look at a blue-black zombies list. So, I was a little torn on this deck. I was debating just scrapping it all together and just trying something else, but you guys on Patreon voted for a Demir deck, and I didn't want to just go for a control list, which is pretty much what blue-black is in a nutshell. If you go blue-black, it's jam-packed full of counter spells and removal, and that's pretty much it. So I wanted to go for a lesser picked blue-black archetype, and it turns out to be zombies. Now, the more I got into it, the less I could justify keeping blue in, which is why it's so heavily skewed into black. And I do believe that the black-white version, or even just the mono-black version, is probably better than this, but I wanted to play around with it anyway. It does some fun things most of the time, so I wanted to play around. So if we look at the blue stuff, essentially, if you're going into blue-black zombies, you are focusing on self-mill for the most part. So a lot of the blue zombies put cards into your graveyard. So what that means is essentially you can effectively have more options with graveyard recursion, things like cemetery recruitment, we'll get to in a second. So the milling is pretty good. The downside is that it can be a bit hit or miss. If this hits two lands, for example, that are not Drownyard Temple, then you're a bit upset. We do have access to Compelling Deterrence, which is a solid bounce spell as well. So for 1 and a blue, instant speed, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, then that player discards a card if you control a zombie. So this can deal with Planeswalkers, tutelage cards, Fevered Visions, any of that kind of thing. Any permanent that you want to get rid of, Compelling Deterrence bounces it. And if your opponent is empty-handed at the time as well, it is just a straight-up removal spell because they have to discard it as soon as you bounce it. So something to be aware of. But the payoff into blue is Geezer and Geralf. 2 a blue and a black for a 4/4 legendary creature. When Geezer and Geralf enters the battlefield, it mills, which goes quite well with the blue zombie archetype, as I mentioned. During each of your turns, you may cast a zombie creature card from your graveyard. Really good for cast triggers. So Diagraph Colossus is one of its abilities is based off of a cast trigger, so that's pretty nice. Essentially, it allows us to enable things like Cemetery Recruitment, Resourceful Return, both of which can grab back Geezer and Geralf. So if we get Geezer and Geralf and it sticks around, most of the time we're probably going to win. If we don't, it could go either way, I would say. But being able to cast anything from your graveyard is great. So Geezer and Geralf then creates removal with Fleshbag Marauder. It creates a wider board state if you get back the Diagraph Colossus. It can pull back Lords. It's got all sorts of stuff that it can do, so it's really good. Only can pull zombies though, so you've got to be aware of that. It won't grab your Kalitas because he is a vampire. He just so happens to have a lot of zombie synergies. So let's go to the beginning anyway. We do have a fair bit of early game. First early game creature is Crypt Breaker, so for 1 and a black for a 1/1. And it has 1 and a black, tap it, discard a card, so we could discard creature cards because we know we're going to get them back, or we could discard lands if we don't need them. We get to put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield. So Crypt Breaker essentially allows us for a go-wide strategy, putting lots of zombies on the board. If we've got Lords, then this gets so much better as well. We also have a way of gaining card advantage as well, with tapping 3 untapped zombies you control, draw a card, and lose 1 life. So it's like Obnixilus's +1, except for it costs us 3 untapped zombies. If we're on the defense though, this is pretty much no cost to us whatsoever, because we can hold back things to block, tap them at the end step. So if we're in kind of a stalemate kind of situation, I think most of the time, as long as Crypt Breaker sticks around, we come out on top for it because we're drawing extra cards. We then have 2 copies of Dread Wanderer, 1 black mana for a 2/1, and it's a battlefield tapped, which is unfortunate. However, it does have the ability of returning itself from the graveyard to the battlefield, so really good with self-mill strategies. If we can get it into our graveyard early, then we can maybe work this out. It does have a little bit of a condition though. We can only do it at sorcery speed and only if we have 1 or fewer cards in hand. So if we've got nothing going on, at the very least we usually have a Dread Wanderer to pull back, so we can constantly threaten 2 points of damage against a control deck, for example, if they're not exiling it. We then have 2 copies of Dark Salvation, great removal spell if you are in zombies, also create zombies. Target player puts X 2/2 black zombie creature tokens onto the battlefield, then up to 1 target creature gets -1/-1 until the end of the turn for each zombie that player controls. In a best case scenario, this could take down an Ulamog for 1 mana, because you pay 2 mana for every 1 zombie that you want, but it also counts the zombies that you currently have as well. So if you already have a widened board state, you can use just 1 mana, not even generating a zombie, to take down a big creature. So it's really good value for that kind of thing. And if you've got loads of mana to spend, then Dark Salvation is also really good for going wide. Let's have a look. Cemetery Recruitment is the next one. So we've got a Grave Recursion package. So that essentially means instead of bringing it to the battlefield, we actually pull it back to hand, which is not ideal, but it does come at the benefit of cheap cards anyway. So for 1 and a black, sorcery speed, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. If it is a zombie, draw a card. So we have a way of pulling creatures out of our graveyard, but we also have a bonus if they are zombies. 90% of the creatures in our deck are zombies. The only exceptions really are Liliana, Kalatas, and Geezer and Geralf. The rest are zombies. So for the most part, Cemetery Recruitment is always going to draw you a card. So what we want to do essentially with Cemetery Recruitment, if we're against maybe a control deck or something like that, is use these to absorb a lot of removal that our opponents might have. So we play the Colossus on turn 3. They end up murdering it, for example. We pay 2 mana, we pull it back, we draw a card. We play it again, he murders it, we pull it back, we draw a card. And we're constantly gaining cards, so he's not really taking too many resources off of us by doing that. As long as he doesn't counter these recruitments, we can gain a fair bit of value all the same. And if he doesn't counter it, then that's good for us, because we've got a lot of value off of the Colossus anyway in the future, and we'll get to that in a second. Also running 2 copies of Resourceful Return. It's effectively the same card as Cemetery Recruitment, except for the draw a card is actually affected by the artifacts. As far as artifacts are concerned, we only have 2 Bontu's Monuments. They are legendary, so we only ever want 1, which is why I'm not running 3 of them, and they're honestly not the biggest game-winning card in the world, so 2 copies I've found to be the sweet spot, and it's going quite well. It only reduces the cost of black creature spells, so there is a lot that it reduces. It makes Geezer and Geralf a 3-drop so that we can use Bontu's Monument turn 3, turn 4 Geezer and Geralf, and we have a 1-drop ready to cast if it mills it off of that, and we also drain for 2 when that eventually happens as well. Kalatas gets to 3 mana, which he's already broken enough at 4 mana, so that's pretty sweet. So it's pretty awesome for us. So we get the draw if we want. Otherwise, it is just another Cemetery Recruitment. We are running a pretty low creature count for a tribal deck, which is why I've got 6 copies of the same effect, just to pull creatures back constantly. We then have Liliana, Heretical Healer. I do enjoy this card, and I usually try to include it in any deck that has Fleshbag Marauder, because it's just so easy to enable with Fleshbag. So for 1 and 2 black, a 2/3 with lifelink. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, exile Liliana, Heretical Healer, then return her to the battlefield transformed under her owner's control. They usually say his or her, don't they? Oh, it's her. Yeah, I suppose. I'm being silly. Never mind. If you do, put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield. So she comes back as Liliana, Defiant Necromancer, and already comes back with something to protect herself with, which is pretty sweet. And it synergizes quite well with the deck. The +2 effect, which allows us to get to our ultimate really quickly, which is where we want to be, allows us to force our opponent to discard a card while also doing it ourselves. So we can do this when it benefits us, and our opponent doesn't get much choice out of it. We want to get to this -8 though, so we probably want to just start recklessly discarding cards. Remember that we can get a lot of things back from the graveyard as well, so it's not the end of the world if we +2 and discard a creature card, for example. The -X allows us to return target non-legendary creature card from the graveyard to the battlefield. So what we can do is we can -3 and use Liliana as a removal spell. We can get back the Colossus so we can go wide. We can go for the Lord of the Accursed. We could even get back Screeching Scab so that we can add to our graveyard so the next minus is more powerful. But really we want to go for the -8. You get an emblem with whenever a creature dies, return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. So yet again, works really well with Fleshbag. If our opponent's creatures die, they come back under our control. So imagine fleshbagging every single turn, because on our end step, when a creature died, it comes back into our control. So fleshbag dies as soon as it enters the battlefield. So we lose our creature, they lose theirs, and every single end step of fleshbag comes back to remove a creature, and if it does remove a creature, then we get it. So our opponent is essentially locked out of playing creatures at that point, which is really good, and I've not really seen many people come back from that unless they are a not creature-based focus deck anyway. But even then, if they're non-creature-based, the discard is going to rip their hand apart and it's just going to be so good. We then got Diagraph Colossus. This is pretty much the win con of the deck most of the time. So for 2 and a black, a 2/2, Diagraph Colossus enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each zombie in your graveyard. So yet again, we benefit from that self-mill from the Screeching Scabs and things like that. It is 3 mana, so it's out of Fatal Push range, which is really good. So it eats the really good removal that our opponent usually has, the unconditional stuff, which is fine by us, because then we can just return it and replay it again. So if we get ourselves a fair amount of counters on it, maybe let's say make it a 5/5, then it's out of Grasp of Darkness range, it's out of burn range, all of that sort of stuff. So the milling really benefits the Colossus, and the longer the game goes on, the more powerful this guy goes. Usually on an end game, the Colossus is usually about an 8/8 that's generating zombies, which is superb value for 3 mana. Whenever you cast a zombie spell, you get to put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield tapped. So we also have a few sacrifice effects, things like Fleshbag Marauder, Kalatas Traitor of Get can sacrifice stuff. So that tapped zombie becomes value for us later down the line. If we want to keep our Fleshbag out of the graveyard, we sack that tapped zombie, so it's really good for that. Lord of the Accursed, after that, is 2 and a black for a 2/3. Other zombies you control get +1/+1. This is most of the reason why you'd want to go back to zombies when the Armor Ket came out. So we've got ourselves a Zombie Lord for 3 mana. 3 mana is a little bit expensive for a Zombie Lord in most formats, but in Duels it's perfectly acceptable. The one on the black to tap all zombies gain Menace as well is really good. Because remember, we do go for a go-wide strategy with the Colossus, so we will have a lot of zombie spells. And if Lord of the Accursed is on the field, then those zombie tokens we're generating are going to be 3/3s, not 2/2s. And by giving them Menace, it means that 2 creatures have to block a single one. So the go-wide strategy just gets so much better with Lord of the Accursed. Bontu's Monument, briefly spoke about this. The drain effect is really useful for us as well. It helps us get through control decks, because even if our creatures don't resolve, we still get this cast trigger, which is really good. And we can drain the last little bits of our opponent's life out, and maintain our life total as well, which keeps us in the game a lot longer, and allows us to fill our graveyard. It's really, really solid. We then have Kalatas, Traitor of Get. So for 2 and 2 black, we have a 3/4 with lifelink. If a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, instead, exile that card and put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield. So zombie synergy, we can get 2/2s, maybe 3/3s, even 4/4s, depending on the amount of lords we've got on the battlefield. So every time we kill a creature, we get a creature. So we're just really going wide quite easily with that one. And the exile effect can be quite relevant in some cases as well. If we make our opponent sacrifice their Ulamog with a Fleshbag, it gets exiled, for example. I had one matchup where our opponent played an Avacyn. It had Indestructible on that turn. I Fleshbagged it with a Kalatas. It got exiled, and I got a zombie out of it. So, really solid stuff. The pay 2 and black, sacrifice another vampire or zombie to get +2/+1/+1 counters on Kalatas. It's also really good. If you can keep Kalatas around, the life gain that he can generate is absurd, and eventually your opponents have to block it, and if they block it, most of the time the creature dies, and you get a zombie out of it. It's really, really good stuff. And he also helps against board wipes and things like that as well, because as he dies, let's say he gets languished, as he dies and everything else dies, this trigger still takes effect. So if the entire board gets wiped, I get a zombie for every single one of the creatures that our opponent controlled. So they're not really wiping the board with a Kalatas down. He's really difficult to deal with, and he's a lot of fun. Speaking of board wipes, we have Yahani's Expertise. So for 2 and 2 black, this is kind of our panic button. We don't mind rebuilding our board either, so wiping our own board state off the map is not the worst thing in the world. All creatures get -3/-3 until the end of the turn. Then you can cast a card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. The majority of our deck is 3 mana or less, so most of the time Yahani's Expertise second ability is going to be in effect. The -3/-3 does kill most of our stuff, but if we've got 2 Lord of the Accursed out, then our lords survive, Kalatas survives, and he can exile based on board wipes. Fleshbag's not sticking around. Diagraph Colossus, most likely going to be above 3 the majority of the time, so really, really solid stuff. It's not going to wipe our board as consistently as maybe a Languish would, which would hit more stuff, granted, but this has the possibility of not hitting our stuff as often, which is really nice. Next, we got 2 copies of Liliana's Mastery as well. So you can see as well, the reason why I'm not so fussed about blue in this deck is most of the lords are in black, so there's really not too much of a reason to be in blue except for having the self-mill strategy, which is a lot of fun. It's the only reason I'm still keeping this deck. It is a ton of fun to self-mill the crap out of yourself and then start pulling zombies every turn out of your graveyard. It's really hard for your opponents to deal with and a lot of fun when they can't. But yeah, it's essentially a Zombie Lord enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, create 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. They would be 3/3s technically as well. So 2 3/3s and a Lord effect for all of your zombies for 5 mana. That 6 power on the board for 5 mana is already good enough, and it pumps every other zombie that you've got in the future. So Liliana's Mastery is a solid card. We then have Liliana, Death's Majesty. 3 and 2 black for a 5 loyalty planeswalker. You can +1 to create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, and then put 2 cards from your library into your graveyard. So we get to feed our graveyard so that our graveyard recursion can do a lot of stuff. If we hit creature cards, we can use our -3 ability to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature is a black zombie in addition to its other types. So when it becomes a zombie, it actually gets the effect of Liliana's Mastery and all of that jazz as well. We can sack it to Kalatas. I do believe that it doesn't stop being a zombie when it goes into the graveyard. I could be wrong about that, but no, it must do. I think it does. Let me know in the comment section below if that actually does affect. I'm not sure if it becomes a black zombie for as long as it's on the battlefield or if it remains one. If it remains one, then it's solid for Geezer and Grolf, but I've never actually had that interaction come into play, so I don't really know. The -7 is a one-sided board wipe that takes us essentially 3 turns to get to without killing Liliana in the process. Destroy all non-zombie creatures. So, yet again, most of the stuff on our board is a zombie. Kalatas, if he's on the battlefield, will die, but he'll die with the rest of the non-zombies, so we'll get zombies in the place of it. So it's really solid. If we can get here, we can do a lot of work in creature-based matchups. Finally, we've got 2 Never to Returns. Never is a 1 and 2 black sorcery speed. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. It's here kind of to deal with creatures, but mostly to deal with the planeswalkers, because we don't have any dedicated planeswalker removal. And most of the time, if you're in black, you want to be running Never in your deck. If you want any kind of removal, this is almost always an auto-include. And it also has Return on the back of it as well. So Return is a 4 and a black Aftermath card, which means we cast it from our graveyard and then exile it. Exile target card from a graveyard, and then create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So the zombie creature token works well in our deck. We can make it into a 4/4, 5/5, anything of that sort, depending on the number of lords we've got. We can also do targeted removal on their graveyard. So if they're a reanimator or they interact with their graveyard in any meaningful way, we've got a way to interact with theirs and prevent them from bringing things back. So in the mirror, for example, we can get rid of their Diagraph Colossus or anything like that. It's not likely to be much of a mirror, because blue-black zombies isn't played very often, but you do see black-white zombies quite a fair bit as well, so that's something to be aware of. That's essentially the deck, guys. Onto the mana base. We are running 6 islands and 9 swamps. We are very skewed into black, so we don't really need more than 1 blue source for the most part. I may even skew swamps a little bit heavier into this deck, but the only reason I've got it so balanced in the way that I do is mostly because Screeching Scab is a 2-drop, and it's really nice to get him down before you get down the Diagraph Colossus or anything of that sort. The self-milling is usually quite important to at least get a little bit of in your deck. We've then got 2 Sunken Hollows. They enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. Not too difficult for us to do. Drowned Catacomb is one of our check lands. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control an island or a swamp. So Sunken Hollow is an island or a swamp, and so are the basics. Drownyard Temples are really good with self-mill strategies because they are a colourless land, which isn't the best. However, they do have an ability to be returned from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped for just 3 mana. So if we do self-mill these guys, these are pretty much the only lands we want to be self-milling, but they do count as sort of ramp in their own little rights. And we've got Evolving Wilds as well to grab that blue source, since we are skewing so heavily in that way. I probably will actually skew this more into 5-10, but 6-9 He's pretty great. Anyway, guys, that's going to do it for the deck. If you do enjoy the look of the deck and you want to see it in action, then be sure to check out the matches. There should be a link to it on the end card in just a matter of moments. If you want to support the channel as well, you can like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that little bell icon as well, right next to the subscription button, and that'll give you notifications when I release new videos. I do hope you've enjoyed, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.